We're going to talk about the importance of having a will. And while we all know we have to have a will and our husbands need to have a will, let's unpack today what can happen if your spouse dies without a will.
I think, as women in this industry, we have first-hand experience of what it's like when women lose their spouses, or when their spouses die without a will. And we understand that, the estate administration process itself is very technical and it can be very difficult, even with a valid will. Yeah. Now, when someone dies without a will or intestate, this can make the process very difficult.
And an executor needs to be appointed, and this person plays a very crucial role in not only winding up the estate, but also helping those who are left behind manage the process. So they've really got an important role to pick up the pieces, and this can't be done by just anybody. Yeah. So the master would need to appoint an executor, and the executor will now have the job of winding up this estate intestate.
In South Africa, there's very strict laws for intestate succession. So the executor is going to have to distribute that estate according to the laws of intestacy. So, for instance, if it's just you and your spouse dies, obviously you would be the intestate heir. But things get more complicated when there are children involved.
Correct, Sue. But let's look at an example, right? We've got a family of 4, there are 2 minor children. The husband, who is the sole breadwinner, dies, leaving this woman and the 2 minor children. Perhaps the woman had taken the role of caregiving and just looking after the kids at home. According to the law of interstate succession, this woman is only entitled to the greater of either 250,000 rand in cash or a child's portion. Yeah. And as the calculation for the child's portion, this is really calculated by taking the entire estate and dividing it by the number of children that are there, including the wife. So we find that the woman cannot claim more than that, even though she's in a position to be the caregiver and even though she was going to look after these children for the rest of her life.
Well, actually, if you look at a practical situation, let's say that woman you're talking about and her husband and the 2 children, let's assume that his estate is valued at 5 million rand and he dies intestate. The child's share, the way they would work that is they would divide his estate by the number of children plus his spouse, which is 3, which means that the woman would be entitled to 1.6 million and the remaining 3.3 million would then devolve to the children, to the 2 minor children. But the problem in this situation is that they're minors. Yes. So those funds would then be housed in the guardian's fund and would be kept there for the children until they are old enough. So what we're sitting with here, where this woman's husband has died without a will, she is sitting at home with 2 minor children. The bulk of his estate is sitting in the guardian's fund and she doesn't work.
Yeah.
So it is not an ideal situation.
No, not at all. And we're assuming that the funds that are inherited are accessible. What happens if it sits in a property? So minor children can inherit the property, but they can't transact on it. So it becomes quite difficult if you have died without a will and you haven't actually made proper allocation for the spouse who's left behind to be able to make decisions and act on decisions.
Yeah. Exactly. And just from experience, we know that dealing with the guardian's fund, it's not always smooth, just like anything, The accused, it's an admin-intensive process. There's paperwork that needs to be submitted every single time you need to, claim some funds. So it's important that, women know this and know that there's a valid will in place. I think that just highlights the importance also of having a will.
Sherry, you're right. And having a valid will means also having a valid will for your foreign assets. So, if your husband dies leaving foreign assets, but no will that deals with those assets, can add another layer of complexity to the whole estate administration process, because those assets would then be administered in terms of the intestate laws of that foreign jurisdiction.
And there could be, additional taxes paid. You could be paying taxes both here and abroad, just depending on where those assets are held.
Absolutely.
We mustn't also forget that it's not all doom and gloom. There are some assets that can fall outside the estate, like retirement funds. But it's also important to note that it's not a straight line, easy process because of 37C, Section 37C.
Yeah.
While your will gives you the freedom of testation to decide who you're going to distribute your assets to, when it comes to retirement funds, when they pay out, it's not necessarily up to you as the owner of those funds to where those funds get distributed. So it's dealt with in terms of Section 37C of the Pension Funds Act. And what that means is that trustees have a duty to ensure that financial dependents receive the proceeds of your retirement fund. So they've got a duty to go out and establish who those financial dependents are and ensure that the distributions are made in an equitable manner.
And then I think on that note, and maybe we can just close off on the issue of liquidity, that, you know, if your husband dies, and you are now left with your children and the estate administration process, which can be a cumbersome and time-consuming one, you need access to capital, to some sort of cash, and that's where something like a life policy could be particularly valuable.
Yes, I think it's also so important to have some sort of relationship with the executor, because they are also able to free up some cash in the process of winding up the estate. So you are able to access some funds from the late estate. The executor is able to do that, but that's obviously only once the death is registered, and we all know the master's office can be a bit slow.
In a nutshell, what we're saying is the estate administration process is not a simple one, and it's not a quick one, and it's made more difficult and more challenging if there isn't a will.